Spoke Dutch as a child. That was her first language. She had a Dutch accent, which she kept throughout her very long, long life. But when the slaves in New York State were freed, Sojourner Truth decided that she was going to change her name, which was Isabella Beaufrey. And she called herself Sojourner because she was going to sojourn up and down the United States, and Truth because she was going to speak out against slavery. She was going to speak up for women's rights. Well, there was a women's rights convention in 1831. I thought it was 1831. It was before Seneca, because it was the Ohio, a women's rights convention, well, maybe 1851, in Akron, Ohio, and she was not a delegate to the convention. So, and the delegates did not want her to speak because they said, if Sojourner Truth speaks, why then the whole issue of women's rights will become confused with slave rights, and there is no connection between the two. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Well, Sojourner Truth sat at the back of the small church auditorium, and she listened to the delegates, and she listened to the speeches. And then when there was a lull in the proceedings, the old lady got out of her seat, marched down the aisle, up the steps, onto the platform, and said, "Well, children, where there's so much racket, there's got to be something out of kilter. Now, I think that twixt the colored folk in the South and the women in the North all shouting about their rights, the white man be in a hell of a fix pretty soon." But what all this here shouting about? Well, one man said that woman need to be lifted into carriages and helped over mud puddles and have the best place everywhere. Well, children, nobody ever help me into a carriage or lift me over a mud puddle or give me the best place anywhere. And aren't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have planted and planted and gathered into bonds, and no man could head me. I could work as hard and eat as much as any man when I could get it. And bear the lash as well. Aren't I a woman? I have birthed 5 children. And I seen all my children but one sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, there was nobody but Jesus to hear me. Aren't I a woman? All right, now, they talk about something in the head. What that they call it? Help me out, children. That's it, honey, thank you. Intellect. Now, what intellect got to do with women's rights? Or colored folks' rights? If my cup don't hold but 1 pint, and your cup hold 1 quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Now, the preacher men say that woman can't have as much rights as men because Christ want a woman. Well, where your Christ come from? Where your Christ come from? He come from God, and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. Now, if the first woman that God ever made was strong enough to turn the whole world upside down all by herself, then these women all together ought to be able to turn it right side up again. And now we is asking to do it. And had better let us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good God. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Oh, God. Charles, you got a tough act to follow. That's all I got to say. I got something in my throat. Charles Blockson is going to talk now about anti-slavery women, women that we may not have heard of, the unsung heroines and mysteries of the Underground Railroad. And then he'll go into some detail about the significance of slave songs and slave codes. And from here, we'll walk over to the pond and sing some of those songs and get some of that inspiration. Okay, Charles.
Like Laurie said, it's indeed a hard act to follow. But I have been on an inspirational journey for the last 2 years. I was asked by the National Geographic magazine to do a story on the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad has always been a part of my life since my great-grandfather escaped from Seaford, Delaware with cousins and so forth. So I have a lot of relatives today in Canada. They escaped from the same part of the eastern shore that Harriet Tubman escaped from. My grandfather was a part of the, and grandmother of the John Brown Club. Since I was a child, I started collecting Afro-American history books long before it was fashionable. Today I have over 20,000 copies, the largest private collection in the country. And I recall the time when I was ridiculed and laughed at. I was an athlete at Penn State. My roommate was Rosie Greer and Lenny Moore were the other. But I took another route. I took the route of collecting our history. And a year ago, I came by and met Miss Bryan, her husband, and Reverend Carter. You don't know the feeling to follow Harriet Tubman Trail from Bucktown in Cambridge, Maryland, up here. When I reached this, as Valerie said, coming over those hills and mountains, I went all over the United States, in the Midwest 3 weeks ago, New England, all through New England, New York State, of course, my home state of Pennsylvania. I wrote a book several years ago, The Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania. I met Laurie at Penn State University, and we toured the 67 counties of Pennsylvania again. The Underground Railroad was a unique mechanism. It had Christians, atheists, Gentiles, Jews, women, and children. Something else came about. I realized the fact, being a historian, I wrote several books before along with my collection. It amazed me that men in the past were more or less chauvinistic. When you hear about a helper on the Underground Railroad, was there a conductor? The conductor was a person who sort of led people like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was more than a conductor. She was an engineer, she was an agent, she was a planner. But the passengers were people who more or less went along. Station masters, depots, stockholders were people such as Garrett Smith from upstate New York, Port of Peterborough. You go across the Tappan Zee Bridge. I went across 2 weeks ago, going into New England up to Cape Cod and throughout. I stopped on the Tappan Zee Bridge and I said, geez, here's a part of the Underground Railroad, Lewis and Arthur Tappan, no matter where I went. And last year when I came up here, after following Harry Tubman through Philadelphia area where I live, into Cape May, through upstate Pennsylvania into New York and Albany, Ithaca and so forth, when I reached the grave last year, tears came in my eyes. I said, how could a woman, 19 times or more, lead so many people? Here I'm a black person going through some towns at night. I'm afraid. I'm 6'3" and 200 and some pounds, you know. How could this woman with dogs and bloodhounds and so forth? But it was grace that led her. And this is grace, her spirit has brought us here today. There's a lot of forces out there who don't want this to happen. But as Frederick Douglass said, my great hero, whom I met years ago, and one of the few people who could see him before he died, I have a huge collection of him, Paul Robeson. The same thing they're trying to do to you, they did to Paul Robeson, his Pigskill and so forth. But our spirits come together. So what is the Underground Railroad? It's composed, as I said, of songs and legends and networks and so forth. It had all types of people. The Native Americans, which I'm a part of, Nanticoke on my father's side in Delaware, and Cherokee on my mother's side. And so many of us today, black and white, have Indian blood or Native American blood. They were left out of the Underground Railroad. The Seneca Indians from Emeryville, Long Island, also the Shawnee Indians, the Indians from Niagara Falls area, the Oswego's, the Shawnees, the Delawares, all was a part of the Underground Railroad. But you don't hear about women, about Indians, about children. Harry Tubman would pay little girls and boys to follow her through, as she came up through Chester County, Pennsylvania, into Philadelphia, Kennett Square, Longwood Garden area, to little girls and boys to follow the slave catchers and hunters. And when they placed reward signs on trees, barns, and so forth, she would pay them to tear them down. This was a part of the Underground Railroad. So there's so many. The role of the Quakers, I have a lot of friends, pardon the pun, who are Quakers. But the fact is, history has more or less, the person who holds the quill controls history. So therefore, they can write whatever they want to write. The Quakers were one of the leaders in the Underground Railroad, the anti-slavery movement, but they did not deserve all the credit that they received. Elizabeth Buffin Chance from Rhode Island would tell you that her father, Arnold, would read out a meeting. Lucretia Mott from Pennsylvania, where I live in the Norristown area, 8 miles from Lamont, Pennsylvania, she was spat upon, as well as John Greenleaf Whittier, who was a Quaker, for their participation. In Rochester, New York, Susan B. Anthony had a violent argument with another Quaker because of her role in the Underground Railroad. Susan B. Anthony, brother Merritt, was a part of John Brown's group at Kansas, when they liberated Kansas. And another person, it's amazing, I sometimes become bored driving the highways all over the Midwest and in New England and throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio. But one thing came about. There was a saying that Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote several years ago. Throughout the conflict, up and down, rode Uncle Tom and old John Brown. And I said to myself, throughout the underground, up and down, rode Harry Tubman and old John Brown. Because no matter where I go, John Brown is another person we must deal with. They have maligned him like they're trying to malign you. Here's a man who knew Henry David Thoreau was in Concord 2 weeks ago, with Thoreau, Sandburg, Emerson, the Alcotts, and so forth. He knew Richard Dana Jr., he knew Frederick Douglass, he knew Harry Tubman. He called Harry Tubman General. When he was captured, Harry Tubman knew there was like a psychic connection between Harry Tubman and John Brown. If Harry Tubman was well that day, she was ill, she would have been at Harper's Ferry. So there's a lot of the Underground Railroad, and it all comes together. What you're doing today is so significant. Sure, you're going to be ridiculed, you're going to be spat upon, you're going to be cursed, harassed, just like the abolitionists whose wells were poisoned and so forth. This is a part of the price that we all must pay. But you must keep going because you are the conduit. I want to move on. There's so much about the Underground Railroad. The free black community were more or less left out. If I escaped, say, from Macon, Georgia, or Louisiana, coming up north, where would I go today? I would generally go to a black community, and this is what happened. You can blend in the black community. Therefore, we had very few people who could write our history. So the Quakers received the credit. The Unitarian did excellent work, people like Theodore Parker and others, but they did their work and went on as silent sentinels, and they didn't record their deeds as much. The Quakers were excellent record keepers, not the Quakers per se. If you ask any slave, any person, any child, did the Quakers ever own slaves? And I do this oftentimes, all throughout the country, no matter where I go. In Philadelphia, my region where I come from, is the city of brotherly love. That's the biggest lie they ever told. As was told by Valerie, Harriet Tubman had trouble riding the streetcar, so did Frederick Douglass, so did William Wells Brown, who escaped, and so forth. William Penn himself, the founder, so-called founder of Pennsylvania, was a Quaker, was a slaveholder. The man who financed the American Revolutionary War, Robert Mars, was a leading slave dealer, Quaker, in Philadelphia. So was Thomas Willings and his son George, who founded Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware is named for the Willington family. The Liberty Bell, what connection does the Liberty Bell have with the anti-slavery movement, the Underground Railroad? A lot. Long before the era of the Friends of Freedom, the Liberty Bell had many names. It was the abolitionists who named the Liberty Bell. Did you know that? This is how they got their name. When I wrote my first book, Pennsylvania's Black History, I put it in there during the time of the bicentennial. People were amazed. So the tour guides had to tell the truth. Next time you go to Philadelphia and you look at that bell, remember it was named for people such as Frederick Douglass, Lydia Maria Childs, William Lord Garrison, Amy Post from Rochester, Susan B. Anthony, William Wells Brown, and even Robert Elizabeth Browning from Europe, Henrietta Martin. They all were part of the Friends of Freedom. They're the ones that said that all bell in the State House should be called the Liberty Bell because of the freedom of women and blacks. So our history must be changed all over again. So when you go to Philadelphia, it's not the city of brotherly love. It was one of the most racist city, and up until recently, the end of the era of Rizzo, it still is. I passed here last year, as I told Reverend Carter, I don't know if you took notice, when you go outside, you'll see a tombstone leaning against the wall. Have you seen this tombstone right in the corner here? Take a look. It's one of the most important tombstones in this whole area. It's the tombstone, a gravestone of Reverend Jermaine Logan from Syracuse, who escaped slavery from the Deep South, Kentucky, made his way on an arduous journey on the Underground Railroad, became one of the greatest conductors in this whole area. Worked with Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and so forth. But yet and still, the gravestone there is leaning against the wall. And I asked Reverend Carter last year, why is it there? And he said, because of vandalism. And it's sort of depressing, to follow the trail of the Underground Railroad, to see a historical marker leaning against the wall. Now, why isn't there a marker for Harriet Tubman? There is no monument in the United States for Harriet Tubman. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? We have our work cut out for us. I want to move along. There's so much more I want to talk about. This is what was a paperback copy of my first book. The reason, you all know this man. Don't shake, we all, don't we? If you live in Seattle, Florida, or Canada, Pennsylvania, we all know this figure, don't we? Do you know the significance of this figure? The significance of this figure started when I did my first book, The Underground Railroad, Pennsylvania Black History, not too far the New Hope area in Bucks County, where Washington crossed to Delaware in 1776. We all know how he went to attack the Hessians. On the other side of the river was a little boy with his father by the name of Thomas Graves. He asked his father and a group of other black men to hold a horse for George Washington, and his father said, yes, you can do it. The little boy died. He stood all night, half the night, and he was froze to death with icicles from his ears and fingers and so forth. George Washington, although a slave owner, he was so touched, and after the war, he said he would commemorate the deed of this little boy on Mount Vernon on the lawn. So he did that. But over the years, the image of this little boy changed. Sometimes it's a man, sometimes he's painted white, sometimes he doesn't have a hat, and so forth. He's holding a lantern. That was one phase, but during the Underground Railroad, the era that we're talking about, Quakers, free blacks, Dunkers, Mennonites, Moravians, and others would sometimes place the statue near a barn, a tree, a door, or a church, indicating to fugitive slaves. Sometimes they would place a flag, American flag, in his hand. If the flag was in the hand, that meant it was okay. If not, don't stop there. The lantern sometime if it was lit at night or whatever, they would know where to go. So this little bigoted, degrading, stereotype statue, when I was a child in Pennsylvania, we would go along the Philadelphia Main Line, along Bryn Mawr College in that area, and destroy every statue that we could find, you know, because we did not know the story. So this is why I have it here, and also it will be a part of the article in the National Geographic magazine, no matter where you go, and I'm sure there's some here in Auburn. They're all over the place. But you should be able to know to pass the story on. Here was a very important symbol of the Underground Railroad. So you see how history repeats itself over and over again. I want to talk a little bit now about, there's so much of the Underground Railroad. I can give a talk on every part, every state.